G'day mates, it's B-Buster here, and I would like to give Talkspace a big shout out for sponsoring this episode. So when it comes to therapy and psychiatry, getting the help that you need has never been so simple. When you're able to access your provider from the comfort of your device, it means therapy can be on your schedule. And alleviating the wait times to get an appointment or the travel time to an office can free up time for the rest of your life. Talkspace is so convenient and accessible, and it helps me feel supported around the clock. Talkspace also lets you send and receive unlimited messages with your dedicated therapist in the Talkspace platform 24/7. With Talkspace, you set goals with your therapist and they hold you accountable to make sure you're really progressing. Therapy can help you shift your perspective, find tools to cope in difficult times, and be a guiding light. I wholeheartedly recommend Talkspace for therapy. You can sign up online and start therapy the same day as you sign up. You can text, video, or send voice messages to your licensed therapist, so it's incredibly convenient to have virtual sessions from the comfort of your home. And when I talk to my therapist about my goals in life, along with how to improve my relationship with my family, it felt great airing things out and really helped me with moving forward in a positive mind frame. Also, as a listener of this podcast, you'll get $100 off your first month with Talkspace. To match with a licensed therapist today, go to Talkspace.com. Make sure to use the code SCARED to get $100 off your first month and show your support for the show. That's SCARED and Talkspace.com. So this takes place years ago when I want to say like 8 or 9, I think. I was on a holiday with my dad at the time, and he'd taken me out for a walk in the woods to a nearby place that we were staying in. We'd gotten pretty far in, and we saw this guy laying face down on the ground. My dad's first thought was that this guy was dead. I mean, he wasn't moving, and he couldn't tell if he was breathing or not. I remember him putting his arm in front of me, though, to try and get me away from what he thought was a corpse. My dad starts reaching into his pocket when the guy on the ground gets up and looks at us. Now, not to be rude, but this guy looked completely off his head. He was doing a kind of mixture between smiling and grimacing. He had dark stains in his clothes, which I now think could have been blood. He stands on his feet and stumbles closer and says, "You know what you've got now, don't you?" This is the first time in my life that I can remember too, where my dad is completely speechless, just stuns. The guy then screams, "You've got a dead man on your hands," and just legs it off into the woods. I don't remember being super terrified, but I was just really confused and a little bit scared. My dad, whenever he tells this story to people, he says that it's the most scared that he's ever been. We immediately left and he called the cops, but apparently nothing ever came of it. They never found the guy, at least. I've been to the place since then, but not into the woods, just in case I ever run into that guy again. So my son, who is now 14, told me that when he was outside playing by the pond in our backyard, that it got really quiet. He couldn't hear anything at all, apparently. But then he started to hear music coming from behind the pond. Mind you, this is not in a rural area, Jacksonville, Florida, but the pond backed up to a sort of wooded area, possibly a preserve, I think. And he said that the music played and he followed it to the backside of the pond. And there he met what he described as shadow kids at the time. He said that they didn't talk, but they played with him. He said that they played tag first, then built rock towers. Then he said that they started to play hide and seek, and he was the seeker. He saw one and he started to chase it. He said that he tripped over a rock and fell, so he stopped because all the other shadows came out and surrounded it. Then 2 larger shadow people, he described them as being big as the house, came out and sort of scolded him. He said it was a menacing feeling, like they were angry and it was his fault. He got scared and ran back into our house. He told me of this whole ordeal, which sounds like it would have taken at least an hour with all of the playing and different games that they played, but He'd only been outside for maybe 5 minutes while I was putting my swimsuit on because I was going to tan and let him play outside. He was tired and even took a nap after. I didn't discredit his story. He isn't and never has been a liar, and he's always just had this sort of whole Gryffindor Harry Potter persona about him, so I knew that he wasn't making it up. It bothered me a lot though, but I didn't bring it up other than to ask if he had seen them ever again. He didn't, and even said that he wished that they would just come back because they were so much fun to play with. Anyway, a few years later, when he was 10, I asked him if he remembered the Shadow Kids and the music. Older now, he said yes, all of it was real too. I remember playing with them for hours and you weren't even worried about me. I thought that I was going to be in big trouble when I got back, but I was just having so much fun. We talked about it a little and what they looked like and stuff, and he told me that they were like shadows but also sort of smoke. They weren't black, they were more transparent but also able to be seen. He said that it's hard to describe, but the closest thing that he can think of is like mist or smoke. Now, I've heard all of these crazy encounters and couldn't believe the similarities. The silence, the music playing, the transparent figures, the loss of time. Yesterday was my first time reading into this, and I've been hooked because of my son's personal experience. I just asked him if he remembered, and he had first tried to do the whole, "Mum, it was probably just temporary schizophrenia or something," because it embarrasses him now, I guess. But when I told him that I was asking because a bunch of people have had the same thing happen to them, he eased up a bit and started talking about it. He said that the music wasn't scary, that it was nice in fact. He again described the misty, smoky transparency of the Shadow Kids and how much the big ones scared him. This time he added that it was dark when he ran home and he went to bed. I'm not sure if that was what he experienced at the time or his memory from being scared made him think that it was dark. But he did go straight to sleep, so I remember that bit. But it was definitely a sunny afternoon in the Florida summer, so I don't know about that. We were also of German ancestry. My grandfather was full German. His parents immigrated to the US from Luxembourg. My son was 6 years old when this happened, and we moved to a new home a few weeks after this experience, and thankfully it just never happened again. Now, that was obviously all strange enough, but the year before my son's encounter, I was asleep in my bedroom with my Boston Terrier, Delgado, and in the middle of the night, I woke up because I heard a loud crack. It sounded like as if a large piece of plywood were to fall into a tile floor or something. In any case, I sat up, and so did my dog. My bedroom was shaped in a sort of way where the doorway is sunken in, and kind of the shape of the state of Alabama, if Alabama had all straight edges, with the southwest corner of the state being where my bedroom door was. Anyway, I looked towards my door because I was going to get up and see what fell. My husband was on the couch in our living room playing video games on the other side of the wall. It was a small 900 square foot apartment, and I could hear the TV. And I'll be if when I looked towards the door I saw someone standing there. I tried to adjust my eyes because my room was pretty dark. My bedroom window was large, but it was facing a wooded area, so there wasn't any moonlight or lights of any kind. My eyes eventually focused, and I could tell that it was a man. I said my husband's name, thinking that it was just him trying to scare me. I didn't get any answers, though. This man stepped out of the doorway, and that's when I realized that it wasn't anyone that I knew. It was a person, and this person was at least 7 feet tall. Looked like a guy wearing normal clothes and a hat, but maybe a baseball cap? It was so dark, but it was definitely a person, and my dog saw it too, and he started growling instantly. That's when the good old cliche overwhelming sense of dread came over me too, and it was like it just poured over me like water. I went from being curious to just full-on adrenaline pumping. The dog was the confirmation that I needed to snap me into survival mode, though. My thoughts were going 1,000 miles per hour. I darted my gaze to our bathroom door, which was also shut, and I knew that I couldn't book it in time before this guy closed in. I had nothing near me that I could use as a weapon, and this guy was so big that he was taking up all the space in front of my closed bedroom door. The dog stood up next to me and started barking like crazy, and I did the only thing that I could manage, and that was to start shouting. I screamed, "Who are you? What are you doing in my room?" No answer. He just stepped in closer. His arms were bowed and he was sort of hunched forward like he was coming to strangle me. As he inched forward, though, the thought crossed my mind that my husband hadn't responded to me yelling and the dog barking yet. And the fact that this person had somehow gotten past him undetected was a physical impossibility. I immediately thought that this tall freak was someone that broke in to kill us and that he had gotten to my husband first and I was next. I wasn't going down without a fight, though, and I remember thinking that he's going to have to overkill me because I'm not going to go down like this. I started screaming for anyone that could possibly hear me. The man is silent and still getting closer. I'm sizing him up now and thinking that maybe if he gets close enough I can kick him and run out the door. I realized that the way that I was sitting wasn't going to be a good position for that, so I started to adjust myself, all while screaming. When suddenly, there's light. My husband, my saving grace, comes tearing through the door and turns on the light. He's yelling, "What's going on? Who is it?" frantically looking around the room. And I tell you no lies when I say that this giant 7-foot-tall scary serial killer just evaporated right in front of my eyes. It wasn't like the lights turned on and nothing was there. This thing just slowly dissipated right in front of me. I watched it fade away just like you would see a ghost in a movie, but it was more 3D, sort of like water mist, if you've ever been to a water park or a theme park where they have those misters that cool you off. It had on what looked like normal clothes, like a shirt and jeans. I remember either the hat or the shirt looked sort of orange, but he had no face. It was maybe 2 feet away from me too, hand stretched out like it was about to grab me, and I could see my husband through it, and then just all of a sudden it was gone. Obviously, I've never been so shook in my entire life. I was shaking and crying, and my husband was just so confused. He thought that I had just had a bad dream. Our neighbor called the police too because of my screaming and had to tell the cops that I had a nightmare. To this day, I know too that I wasn't asleep. I know the difference between half dreaming and being asleep and dreaming. Dogs can't see your dreams either. I was so scared that night that I shook uncontrollably for like hours. I've literally never been that terrified to the point that I couldn't stop trembling, which has never happened. And I've had a rough life with plenty of scary real-life happenings. I couldn't sleep all night, and I didn't fall asleep by myself for years after this. The strange thing is that whatever my son saw that day, it sounds a lot like this. So sleeping in a car is definitely not always the best, and I have 2 different encounters where I thought that I was about to enter the nightmare of my life. So the first one, I was camping about an hour from Santa Fe on a weeknight. It was cold. I was supposed to leave early in the morning for Texas, and it was forecasted to snow. Being the young genius that I was, I slept in my Jeep's inner gate all these. Middle of the night, an SUV quite literally skids to a stop across the gravel into my campground. This wakes me up, and I'm obviously on edge now. This SUV is blasting mariachi music. Incredibly odd, but I figured these people were just drunks or they were high or something. The doors open, and these people get out and start running through the woods, screaming bloody murder. What I mean by this, too, is these people sound like they're going to die. I am at an absolute utter loss, and maybe a minute or 2 passes, and everything just gets suddenly quiet, and I don't hear them anymore. Tucked into my sleeping bag, I'm pretty terrified. I'm sitting there, cramped up in the back of my Jeep, wishing and praying them away. And I don't know how long it was, but I dared not look at my phone. Eventually, though, I heard quiet voices around my Jeep. The only thing that I caught was, "Do you think somebody is in there?" And as you can imagine, I absolutely lost my cool. I started screaming and crawled as fast as I could to the front seat, where I turned the lights on and the key on the ignition. As I looked up, I see these people scattering away like roaches into the trees and down the mountainside. And ever since, I keep a J-frame revolver in my center console whenever I travel. My state's permit is actually recognized in a lot of places, so it's a nice luxury to have, especially when encounters like this happen. The second story is that this was in the city of Little Rock in Arkansas. I was heading to Oklahoma from the East Coast to visit family for Christmas. I was too cheap to pay for a hotel, so I got off on I-40, parked behind a hotel, and I slept in my Jeep. Middle of the night, I get woken up by the sound of a small scraping noise, though. Confused, I open my eyes to see a figure outside, attempting to work the zipper on my soft top. Horrified, I simply sat there, and it wasn't until he or she managed to stick their hand through the small opening that they'd created that I reached out, grabbed the nearest thing to me, which was a Coleman lantern, and smashed their hand with it. Without waiting to see the result of this, I jumped into the front seat, worked the ignition, and peeled out of that hotel parking lot faster than I think I ever left anywhere. I didn't stop for gas, red lights, breakfast, or anything. I emerged straight onto the I-40 and continued west for almost 30 miles, and needless to say, that was the last time that I ever slept in my Jeep. I've lived in Southern California my entire life, pretty much. And if you know anything about California, it's very diverse. Up north is filled with mountains and trees, and the south is a lot more, well, city-like. And this summer, I decided to take a trip to Lake Tahoe. It's a beautiful place, and my first time being upstate. But I'll chop this story up into segments of sorts to make it easy to understand. So day one, I settled into the cabin at around 5 p.m. After an 8-hour drive, I was pretty tired too, so I went and lay down in the bed that was in the loft. It was quiet too. It was like being in a different world. I was so used to cars zooming by and people talking right outside of my house, but here, it was quiet. I fell asleep fairly quickly too, but around 4 hours into my sleep, I jerked up from my sleep. I looked around for a bit before hearing a strange tapping noise. I looked around to see where it was coming from, but to no avail. It honestly sounded like somebody was tapping on the window part of the back door, but in the end I just figured that I was being paranoid, and I fell back to sleep. Day 2, nothing happened that day, and I slept fine. Day 3, I woke up early in the morning, maybe 4 o'clock, and I heard a crash coming from the attic ladder that was placed conveniently right behind the couch that I was sleeping on. And I completely froze. And then I heard footsteps. You know that feeling you get when you feel like somebody is staring at you? That's how I felt. I was on my side, staring straight ahead, when suddenly I felt somebody or something crawl over me. I felt their 2 hands on either sides of me, and I knew their face was only inches away from mine. Like I said, I was facing straight ahead, and I wasn't going to turn to face to see who it was. They stayed there, too, for what must have been at least 2 minutes, until I just felt them crawl backwards, and then off the couch. I heard the dog let out a sort of muffled bark, in which time someone shushed her, then let out a good girl. The presence stayed there for what felt like forever, until I heard footsteps going out of the back door. Still, I didn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. But needless to say, I didn't go back to sleep that night. I checked on my friends a bit later on when I felt the coast was clear. None of them had left their rooms that night, and I told them my experience, and they said that was weird and I was being paranoid. And in the end, I sort of halfway agreed with them, and our day just went on as planned. Later that day, after a day at the lake with my friends, we came back to a quiet and cozy cabin. The caretakers of the cabin told us that there was a river a bit farther back into the woods, about a 15-minute walk, and my friends decided to stay back and rest, so I took some bug spray and a small backpack with some snacks and my phone. It was a pretty straightforward trail. There was tall grass on either sides of the trail, and it was a thin path, but pretty easy to navigate. When I got to the riverbank, there were 2 picnic tables there. I didn't want to get eaten alive by mosquitoes, and I'd stupidly worn sandals. So I put my bag on the table and fumbled around with some stuff for a bit, and then I started my walk back to the cabin. For some odd reason, too, the path just seemed distorted. What was once a straightforward trail was now covered in rough terrain. I noticed the tall grass on the side of the path that had been disturbed, and it was as if something huge, and I mean gigantic, had walked across the long grass. At first, I thought maybe it was just a bear, since the locals had told us that bears were a problem this time of year, but the sheer size of it made me sort of second-guess it. I was a bit taken aback by this, but I continued, and I made it back to the cabin. Then I went back to the river eventually, and I was a little frightened now, but I kept telling myself that I was just freaking myself out and I should enjoy the nature. I sat down at one of the tables and watched the river for a bit, but after a while I could have sworn that there was something staring at me. I looked around, assuming one of my friends was on their way to prank me, but there was no one. Across the river, I noticed a bit of brush that was shaken up. There was a clearing in the bushes that was fenced off by 2 logs in a sort of X shape. The longer that I sat in that spot, the more worried I became. I just couldn't help but feel that there was something behind the thick brush that I couldn't see. I went down the river at that point, hoping to come across some kind of life, but there was literally nothing. No fish, no frogs, no roads, just mosquitoes, and a bunch of them at that. Disappointed now with the lack of anything, really, I just went to sit back at the table, and that was when I heard it. It was a noise that I just really find hard to describe. It was a scream, but more like a gurgle, as if whatever it was had a mouthful of water. It was inhuman, definitely, but I froze, and in that moment I should have been running for my life, I know, but in the end I just froze. I heard rustling in the bushes behind me, the ones that I was worried about earlier. Then again the scream, and it was the loudest thing that I'd ever heard. And then I just ran. I sprinted my butt through that forest, and what should have been a quick trip back to the cabin was anything but that. Because after about 10 minutes of sprinting, I finally noticed that I was completely lost. I stopped for a few moments, frantic to see if I could find anything that looked familiar, and then I saw a bridge that I crossed on my way there, and I started sprinting that way. I thought to myself, why didn't the damn thing just kill me? I mean, I'd stopped for a good minute, and then I could hear it chasing me again. It felt like it was a game for this thing. What I mean is that every time I stopped, it would as well. Eventually, I finally made it back to my cabin, and instead of going inside, I just sort of stood on the porch. I faced the forest, and I just cried. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, but somehow I just knew that it was still out there. I didn't want to turn my back to it, so I must have sat there for hours, just silently crying away, occasionally checking my phone, and, well, writing this down. I don't know what the heck that thing was. The only thing that I can even compare it to is maybe a Wendigo or something, but I've never heard of Wendigos gurgling like that. All I do know is that I will not be going back to that river ever again. If you could please shed some light on what or who might have been out there, then I would really appreciate it. These past 2 days have just been too weird to not be connected. Also, we actually burned some sage that night before heading to bed. Brett, one of the guys there, came up to me at around 4 in the morning and told me that he couldn't sleep. We watch TV for a little while before, again, we hear the taps on the back window. We decided not to check it out because, well, quite frankly, we were scared as heck, but after about 10 minutes, the tapping stopped. But Brett and I took turns on sleeping, and no other strange things occurred that night. Brett and I were actually woken up by loud banging on the shed out back, but that could have been an animal or anything really. But at this point, I'm just really excited to get back to my city life and leave this place forever, and all of its weird stuff behind me. Anyway, I had my friend Brett go up into the attic too, while me and some others watched from below, but there was, of course, nothing up there. And to be honest, I'm really not sure if I feel better or worse, knowing that there's nothing up there.
G'day mates, it's B-Buster here, and I would like to give Talkspace a big shout out for sponsoring this episode. So when it comes to therapy and psychiatry, getting the help that you need has never been so simple. When you're able to access your provider from the comfort of your device, it means therapy can be on your schedule. And alleviating the wait times to get an appointment or the travel time to an office can free up time for the rest of your life. Talkspace is so convenient and accessible, and it helps me feel supported around the clock. Talkspace also lets you send and receive unlimited messages with your dedicated therapist in the Talkspace platform 24/7. With Talkspace, you set goals with your therapist and they hold you accountable to make sure you're really progressing. Therapy can help you shift your perspective, find tools to cope in difficult times, and be a guiding light. I wholeheartedly recommend Talkspace for therapy. You can sign up online and start therapy the same day as you sign up. You can text, video, or send voice messages to your licensed therapist, so it's incredibly convenient to have virtual sessions from the comfort of your home. And when I talk to my therapist about my goals in life, along with how to improve my relationship with my family, it felt great airing things out and really helped me with moving forward in a positive mind frame. Also, as a listener of this podcast, you'll get $100 off your first month with Talkspace. To match with a licensed therapist today, go to Talkspace.com. Make sure to use the code SCARED to get $100 off your first month and show your support for the show. That's SCARED and Talkspace.com.
I had just turned 20 in March of this year and had started to get out more on my own. I was always shy and never really wanted to go out alone, but now I started to feel a bit more comfortable. I just ordered myself a pocket knife. I actually have a few now, and would carry it with me most of the time when I went out for my daily walks. And this one time in June was one time that I was blessed to have thought of bringing my pocket knife with me. Let me tell you that. So it was around 8 PM when I decided to go for my walk. Usually I would try and go in the morning or early afternoon, but it had been raining all day, so my walk was pretty delayed. I put on a light hoodie and I was about to head out when I realized that my knife wasn't in my pocket. I went back up quickly and I got it and it was on my way. My usual walk is around 3 to 4 miles, I would guess, and I'm a pretty fast walker, so I could cut the miles to about 2.5 hours max. I would take this side of the street to the main road that had a walkway for about half a mile before it turned into the suburban area. But before you hit that area too, there was this path that cut through a forested area that had a few cabins and parks and whatnot. So, as I made my way, I had noticed a figure hanging beside a tree on the far side of one of the cabins. I took a quick glance at him and continued past him. For your insight too, I'm trans male and 5'1", so I would get mistaken a lot for a small 15-year-old kid. But as I made it to the end of the path, I had noticed out of the corner of my eye that the man was now about 15 feet away from me. The dude was pretty tall, at least 6'3", I would guess. He was well built and was wearing torn jeans and a worn hoodie that seemed to be a bit big for him. I began to speed up my walking at this as I turned the corner and shot a quick glance behind me. He was still behind me and just staring at me now as he was making long strides towards me. At this point, I was beginning to freak out. He seemed to be getting closer with every step, and I quickly took a hold of my knife in my pocket and had my finger on the flipper. And the next part has been burned into my memory for life. I felt a large hand grab my shoulder and pull me back. I have no clue how I managed to quickly whip around and flick open my knife like I did and swipe it towards his face in just a few seconds, though it felt like minutes. But the man, in a blink of an eye, jerked his face back, bringing up his hand as my knife sliced his palm of his hand. He let out a sort of pained yell and fell back a few steps, clutching his hand. It felt like I had just scraped him, but his hand was already completely bloody, and a small pool of blood was starting to form at his feet. He looked at me with anger filled in his eyes, and then he just took off the other way. I stood there for a few minutes before realizing what had just happened, and I went home as fast as I could to call the police. I answered their questions, and then they took my knife to get a blood sample of this dude. I was shaken from this experience and stayed with my brother for a few nights. A few weeks later, the cops returned and told me that, yep, they had found the guy. And yeah, he was wanted for sexual assault. I was shocked, but also happy that they had found this guy. My knife was also returned to me a few days later, which I was thankful for. For those who want to know what type of pocket knife it was just a tac force knife, or for those who might know, a TF 705.